Shalom and welcome to Temple Talk. This is Yitzchak Reuven, alone in the studio one more time, as Rabbi Richman is already on his way back home here to Israel, and he will be back with us, God willing, next week in Temple Talk. Today is the third day of the month of Tammuz, 5777, 27th day of June, 2017, and this coming Shabbat, we read Parshat Chukat. Zot Chukat Torah, it says at the beginning of Parshat Chukat. It's very nice. Parshat Chukat begins with the laws about the Red Heifer. And how nice, after having read Parshat Shlach and then Parshat Korah, which each began with and were actually named after incidents which are very troubling and disturbing. This Parsha Chukat is actually named after the Chukat of the Red Heifer, which is one of the mysteries of the Torah, because it is such a complex and seemingly paradoxical commandment or set of commandments about the Red Heifer. But the beauty of the Red Heifer is that it brings purity back into the world, and it is the antidote, we could say, for the impurity which is incurred when one comes in contact with death. And death has a place in this world, but it's a temporary place in this world. And there's an illusion to it, and that illusion is of permanence. And Torah teaches us that the reality of death is a transient reality, and that life itself is what is permanent and eternal. And the Red Heifer, the ashes of the Red Heifer, come to teach us that and come to enable us to gain this purity and release ourselves from the encumbrance of the illusion of death as a permanent reality in our world. And of course, the ashes of the Red Heifer are very, very essential in the Holy Temple, because one needs to be purified by the ashes of the Red Heifer in order to enter into the inner courtyards of the Holy Temple, where, of course, the avodah, the service of the Holy Temple, is performed each day. So, without that, there really can't be a daily performance of the avodah, which is the word for the service in the Holy Temple. So, of course, as you all may know, or may not, if you're new, the Temple Institute has been studying and dealing with the subject of the Red Heifer for many, many years now. And all the vessels that we build to be used in the Holy Temple, and all the education and teaching that we present to refamiliarize people with the importance of the Holy Temple and with how the Holy Temple works. All this is for naught if there is not going to be a revival of the ashes of the Red Heifer, because we need those ashes in order to achieve the purity necessary to renew the service in the Holy Temple. So, as many of you may know, 2 years ago, the Temple Institute kicked off a new project with a fundraising program to raise seed money for the project, which was entitled, very appropriately, Raise a Red Heifer in Israel. And for all of those who remember it, and all of those who may have made a donation, you should know that we are working at this day by day and are making tremendous progress. And we have posted on our Facebook page today photographs which were taken recently on a location here in Israel, on a cattle ranch. A photograph shows 5 red angus females who are each carrying fetuses, and God willing, next year in 2018, when they give birth, God willing, we'll have one or more candidate for a red heifer, so that we can proceed forward with actually acquiring the ashes of the red heifer. We're working in more than one location here in Israel in order to raise red heifers, and the photographs that we're sharing right now, it's one of the locations, just one of the locations where we are proceeding forward with our program to raise red heifers here in Israel. Of course, a red heifer has to be born. This is all this information I'm about to share with you right now can be gleaned if you look in the book of Numbers, chapter 19, beginning with verse 1. Hashem spoke to Moses and to Aaron, saying, "This is the decree of the Torah which Hashem has commanded, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, and they shall take to you a completely red cow." Actually, should be heifer, which is without blemish, and upon which a yoke has not come. Ye shall give it to Eleazar the Kohen, and he shall take it out the outside of the camp, and someone shall slaughter it in his presence. Eleazar the Kohen shall take some of its blood with his forefinger and sprinkle some of its blood toward the front of the tent of meeting 7 times. Someone shall burn the cow before his eyes, its hide and its flesh and its blood, with its dung shall he burn. The Kohen shall take cedar wood, hyssop, and crimson thread, and he shall throw them into the burning of the cow, etc., etc. It goes on in great detail. And of course, in order to actually understand how to do this in a practical level, takes tremendous study and research into not just the Torah itself, but the oral Torah, the Mishnah. There's actually a Mishnah, tractate Parah, which deals exclusively with these laws concerning the red heifer. And from all this, we can understand the practical requirements and implications, and some of those things I'll share with you right now. Of course, to be deemed a candidate for red heifer, the calf born has to be a heifer, has to be a male calf, and it needs to be completely red. That is, all its hairs need to be red. If it's all red but has a couple of white hairs or another color, it's not a candidate for red heifer. Its red color has to also be on the skin that's exposed around its nose, has to be of a reddish hue. Its hooves also have to be of a reddish hue, and this exists. It's not so rare. There are different breeds of cattle which are red, have red hair, and it potentially could be a red heifer from any of these different breeds. We're working with red angus because they are very prevalent, and they exist here in Israel, and they are very red. And from our past experience, they produce, not infrequently produce candidates for red heifers. Now, apart from the red hue and the red hair, a red heifer also must be unblemished, which we just read, meaning that it has to be cared for and probably separated from other cows so it won't get into a fight or otherwise possibly cause injury to itself. It needs to be in an enclosure which is safe and not likely to cause him an injury. Simple things like tagging the ears of cows, which is common today, can't be done. There has to be another way to properly identify it. And things like vaccines have to be applied in a very careful way so that it's not going to create a permanent blemish on the cow. Now, all that being done, the cow becomes a candidate for the red heifer when it reaches a certain age, which is 2 years. And so the cow must be periodically checked throughout those 2 years to make sure that it hasn't grown any hairs that aren't red. So sometimes in the past we've observed cows which were perfectly red and which fulfilled all the requirements of a red heifer, and then after 6 months, after a year, grew a few hairs that disqualified it. That happens. So anyway, that is one of the projects that the Temple Institute is working on currently with professional cattlemen. And we will keep you informed as things progress. So like I said, we posted a few photographs. We have a short video clip which we'll post later in the week. And we'll be sharing all that with you. We actually have on our website now for many years a full book-length entry written by Rabbi Chaim Richman, who is known as the world's foremost English-speaking expert on the red heifer. And if you go to templeinstitute.org and you look in our menu, you'll see one item entitled Red Heifer. And if you click on that, you will go to this. Like I said, it was actually excerpted from a book that the rabbi wrote and published a number of years ago. It's no longer in print. And it is all about the law and the lore and the history and the significance of the red heifer. I highly recommend looking at that. Once again, templeinstitute.org. So, this week's parsha begins with the statute of the red heifer. Statute in Israel is called a chok, or Chukat. In this case, it's Chukat Torah is referred to. This is the actual statute. It's referred to as the statute of the Torah. It's given a grand title here in Parshat Chukat. He says, the Torah says, Zot Chukat Torah. This is the chok. This is the statute of the Torah. What is a statute in the eyes of the Torah? There are 3 types of commandments given in Torah. One are the mishpatim, which are, I would generally in English translate that as civil laws between man and man. And they are laws such as don't murder, laws such as don't steal, laws which are between human beings and which, when observed, create a civil and civilized society. And they're pretty easily understandable. I mean, we understand why we're not supposed to kill one another. We understand why we're not supposed to steal from one another. There is another type of commandment called a chok. And a chok is a commandment that requires a relationship between man and God. And in the case of a chok, it's usually a commandment that doesn't necessarily have a logical explanation. For example, keeping kashrut, separating milk from meat, eating only certain animals and not others. That's a law that we observed because God said, observe this. And there's not a real logic to it. There's not a real logic as to why we don't eat shellfish. But that doesn't stop us from keeping this commandment because it is a commandment that God has commanded us. And so it's a chok. It does not necessarily have a logical explanation. Now, keeping kashrut, there's all sorts of explanations. It's healthy, it has benefits, it teaches us this, it teaches us that, it keeps us more sensitive to what we consume. All these things are true, and all these things are definitely benefits. But the essence of the commandment is God commanded it and we keep it. It's our covenant with God, and by very virtue of the fact that it's not something that's readily understandable or readily something that we can grasp with our intellect and justify. Because of that, it is a greater commitment. It's a sign of a greater commitment toward God. So what's considered the ultimate of these statutes, of these chukot, is the red heifer. And part of the reason, or maybe the main reason for that, is, as we see when you read the description of it in the Torah, in this week's parsha, from Numbers 19, that the Kohen, the priest, who is ministering the red ashes to simple Jews who want to go up to the Temple Mount to bring their offerings. I'm sorry, I need to rephrase that. The Kohen, the priest who is preparing the solution of the red ashes, of the ashes of the red heifer, when doing so, he himself enters into a state of impurity. And that is considered to be a paradox. Why should something that brings purity into the world also make impure the person who is applying it to another person? And that is a paradox that tradition holds it. Only one man ever grasped the meaning of it. And that man was Moshe. And it would seem that he grasped it because, as we learn in another place, he was described as, in Torah, as the most humble man on earth. And that in his complete humility, he had no ego or intellectual preconceived notions that would encumber him, and he could understand from a perspective that for others it's difficult, to the point of being nearly impossible to grasp what's going on here in this beautiful, beautiful process which the Torah describes, which actually purifies a person from the limitations of death. And the arch foe of Moshe that we confronted last week, in last week's parsha, Korah, who was a man full of ego, a man who wanted to rule the world, really, a man who confronted Moshe and tried to shame Moshe with his greater intellect, because the fact of the matter is that Korah had a tremendous intellect, and he was brilliant. And he kept posing questions to Moshe, saying, well, what about this, what about that? Trying to trip him up, trying to make Moshe look foolish in the eyes of the people. And the fact is that the difference between Moshe and Korah was that Moshe was a man without ego, and Korah was a man who was totally burdened and eventually brought down by his own ego. And the real thing that separated them ultimately was something such as the red heifer. This separated the men from the boys, and this is where Moshe really proved his leadership through his humility, through his ability to bring himself close to God because there was nothing to separate him from God. And this is why God said, he is my faithful servant in all my household. It is Moshe. And Korah, well, he had walls and infinities between himself and God because he was just so full of his own hubris. I digress. So, that's what we're going to say about the red heifer for the moment. Then the parsha goes on to, right after the red heifer, talks about the death of Miriam. Miriam, the older sister of Moshe, the younger sister of Aaron. You know, Miriam really was the original Wonder Woman. Anybody who has seen the movie Wonder Woman will know what I'm talking about. Anybody who hasn't really should, because it is a very, very powerful movie. But Miriam was the original Wonder Woman. She's the one who, if you recall, we've talked about many times, according to Midrash, she was the one who brought her parents together after they separated, after the decree from Pharaoh that he'd be killing all the Hebrew babies. They said, we don't want to bring a baby into the world who will just be killed. And she said, what are you talking about? You must bring babies into the world. That's how we're going to fight this decree. And they got back together. Moshe was born. She was the one who watched him from behind the reeds as he was put into a basket and by his parents, put on the Nile River because they could no longer hide him from Pharaoh's police who visited the Hebrew homes each day to look for infants to drown in the Nile. And she was the one who, when she saw the daughter of Pharaoh rescue Moshe, she was the one who went up to her and said, I can find a Hebrew woman who can nurse that baby, and indeed found her mother, Moshe's own mother, to nurse him. And so the fact of the matter is, Moshe owes his life to Miriam, and the nation of Israel owes its life to Moshe. So Miriam was the heroine behind the scenes, the Wonder Woman behind the scenes. And here's that music. So we're going to pause for a moment. We'll continue with Miriam, Wonder Woman, as we get back to part 2 of Temple Talk. Shalom and welcome back to Temple Talk. This is Yitzchak Reuven. Once again, Rabbi Richmond will be back next week, and we all are looking forward to that. Today is the third day of the month of Tammuz, 5777, June 27th, 2017. Temple Talk coming to you from Jerusalem. Been talking about Parashat Chukat, which we read this coming Shabbat. Begins the book of Numbers, chapter 19, and it begins with the discussion of the red heifer, which we've talked about, and then goes on to the death of Miriam, which we were in the middle of talking about. I call Miriam Wonder Woman. And another one of the wondrous things about Miriam is that she provided the source of water for the children of Israel in the desert. Miriam's well, her legendary well, it is said that a well, a body of water, followed Israel throughout the desert. Wherever Israel went, the well followed. The well was connected to Miriam. And in fact, Miriam, Aaron, and Moshe, 3 siblings who led Israel through the desert, it is said that the cloud of glory which covered the tabernacle each day, that the cloud of glory was through the merit of Aaron, and that the manna was through the merit of Moshe, and that the water was through the merit of Miriam. And eventually, when Israel entered into the land of Israel after the death of Miriam, that well also moved into the land of Israel and reached its permanent location, which is somewhere in the Kinneret, otherwise known as the Sea of Galilee. That is the permanent location of the well of Miriam, which helped to water the children of Israel throughout the desert. And immediately after she dies, and her death is reported in this week's parsha, of course, children of Israel complain that they have no water, which leads to God telling Moshe and Aaron to speak to the rock, and water will come forth. And of course, Moshe hits the rock twice, and God says, that's it. You and Aaron are not entering the land because you did not sanctify me in front of the children of Israel, because you hit the rock instead of talking to it as I instructed you to. Immediately after, the parsha begins to talk about the battles that Israel has to engage in order to get over to the land of Israel. And one thing we learn from this is that Moshe, despite the fact being told you're not going in, immediately pursued bringing Israel into the land, and so immediately had to confront the other nations who did not prove to be particularly generous, even when Israel said to Edom, for example. Edom, the descendants of Esau, the brother of Yaakov. He said, let us pass through your land. You know our story. You know where we've been. You know that we come from Canaan. We're going to return to Canaan. Let us pass through your land to get back home. We will just walk through. We will not descend upon your orchards or your fields. We won't drink from your water. We just want passage through. And Edom said, no way. And Israel was not going to fight Edom because, well, they're cousins, so they had to move all the way around, after which point they did have to engage in battle. From this point on, children of Israel would have to summon up the well of Miriam in their own devices, which actually the rabbi talks about in this week's video teaching of Parshat Chukat. So I'm not going to talk about it now. I don't want to spoil it. In other news, the Temple Mount. Temple Mount will open tomorrow, reopen tomorrow to Jews. It was closed last Monday to Jews after more violence, Muslim violence on the Mount, in the final week of Ramadan, which is the holy month for Muslims. It actually ended Saturday nights, but it's followed by a few days of festival. So the Mount will be reopened tomorrow to non-Muslims, and I'm sure many Jews will be going back up. And in fact, on Thursday, they're already working to organize a large aliyah, a large ascent to the Temple Mount, despite the fact that for the past week, the Mount has been closed. This past month of Sivan, which ended Motzei Shabbat on Saturday night, saw a 100% increase in Jewish aliyah to the Temple Mount since last year's Sivan. And those numbers just keep going up. Very, very encouraging. And anybody who's been looking at our Facebook page this week will see that we've posted a few things, a few short videos. The current Minister of Internal Security, Gilad Erdan, who was actually the man in charge of the police, who has, I think, been the one behind making Jewish experience on the Temple Mount much more friendly, even though we're still not allowed to do anything in terms of Jewish identity or worship, but it is much more friendly. He pointed out in a speech that he delivered to a Jerusalem conference, he pointed out that the Temple Mount is the holiest place to the Jews, and it belongs to the Jews and only to the Jews. Coming from a government minister, that's very encouraging to hear, and something which really startled my ears was about a 5-minute report on Israel's Channel 10 News. Not known to be, it's not a religious channel. It's not a right-wing channel. It's not a conservative or anything else channel. It's a news channel here in Israel. It's the media like most modern media. Had actually a 5-minute report from a reporter who has been to the Temple Mount and reported on what it's like for a Jew to go up to the Temple Mount. And his report was very, very accurate and very, very insightful. And basically, he concluded with the obvious conclusion that there is no freedom of religion for non-Muslims on the Temple Mount. And isn't it about time that changes? So I just think this is one more sign of a change that is just sweeping Israel. I would say even sweeping, because it's really happening. That people are waking up to the fact that there is a Temple Mount, and it is embedded in our consciousness, embedded in our minds, embedded in our hearts, that it is not only part of our identity, but it really is our identity. And it really is the holy place for the Jewish people. And it really is a place designated by God where His presence is strongest. And these aren't things that you can take lightly or take for granted or decide that, well, thanks but no thanks. It just doesn't work that way. It is too much of our identity to be casually discarded. And it's coming back strong into the consciousness of the people of Israel here. And that's very, very, very encouraging, and it's incumbent upon us to continue to work steadily forward and bring more and more people into this ever expanding circle of people who go up to the Temple Mount, and people who cherish the Temple Mount, and people who long to build a holy temple. And it's very, very encouraging to hear different voices expressing their identification with the Temple Mount. Now, Temple Mount was closed to Jews for the past, it'll be 8 or 9 days. And photos taken from the Temple Mount during this time are very, very disturbing. Photos showing banners and flags of various terrorist organizations, and the most horrific, vile, and disgusting thing which took place was at the end of each day in this month of Ramadan, where Muslims fast. In the evening they eat, and they pass out candies, sweets, ostensibly to young children and others. And they're passing out plastic packages, plastic containers of candies. And on each of these containers were the faces of different terrorists who murdered Jews. Faces that you recognize from the media, because you saw their faces when they committed the murders. And this is how they're celebrating on the Temple Mount, the holiest place in the world for Jews and for others who regard it with holiness and who sanctify it with their actions and their words. I can hardly accept that it is, quote, the third holiest place for Muslims. What's holy about a place where you celebrate terror, where you celebrate murder? That's holy? That's how you behave in a holy fashion? That's That's how you sanctify a place? That's how you show your respect to a holy place? I don't think so. Frankly, I think it's all a sham. Frankly, I think it's holy to the Muslims because it's holy to the Jews. I think if the Jews decreed Tel Aviv as holy, then the Muslims would flock to Tel Aviv in order to ensure that it's really the third holiest place in the world for Islam. I think if Israel decided that some backwater in the middle of nowhere had special holiness, I think that the Muslims would flock to that as well. I think it is strictly a political mechanism to just to torment the Jews and to keep the Jews away from their holy site, and it works very well. And it's time that we continue to reassert our presence on the Temple Mount, because I think as our presence grows, as the Jewish presence grows, and as the Jewish consciousness and connection to the Temple Mount grows, I think the Muslim presence there will actually wane. I think that's how it works. When you show that you're serious, when you show that you're permanent, when you show that you're here, that you're not going anywhere, and that you get it, and you're not going to be fooled anymore, then Muslims and other bullies. When I say Muslims, I'm not talking about every Muslim in the world, okay? I'm talking about those who make it their life's work to fight Israel, and their life's work to try to keep Jews off of the Temple Mount, whether it's the Jordanian Waqf or whether it's now the government of Turkey which is pouring millions of dollars into organizations which work to try to keep Jews off the Temple Mount, or whether it's Abbas, the head of the Palestinian Authority, who says that the Temple Mount must be kept clean from the impure and disgusting feet of Jews, or whether it's Iran. These are the Muslims I'm talking about. They can all go jump in the sea and leave the Temple Mount for people who really care about it, respect it, cherish it, honor its holiness, and know what to do there. So that's the Temple Mount. Soon we'll be posting photographs again of Jews up on the Temple Mount, and I encourage everybody who wishes to go to the Temple Mount in purity and wishes to see with your own eyes and feel with your own heart what it's like to be in the Temple Mount, to join us and to go up to the Temple Mount. Once again, it is open and will be open again starting tomorrow. To non-Muslims every morning, Sunday through Thursday, from 7:30 to 11 a.m., and once again in the afternoon from 1:30 to 2:30. It's the place to visit. It's the place to be. And ultimately, it will be the place to be in the Holy Temple. Brings us back to the Red Heifer, which brings us back to our parasha. One thing we didn't mention before, the Jews, I said, Israelites, after Miriam died, they complained of no water. Moshe fixed that, and they got water. And then later in the same parasha, once again they complained no water, and this time God takes matters into his own hands and sends the plague of snakes, which are biting the Israelites and killing them. And in order to stop that plague of snakes, God orders Moshe to make a bronze serpent, put it on a pole, So it'll be like a banner, almost like a flag, and hold it up to the people. And if a person's been bitten by a snake and he looks at the bronze serpent, then he will be cured and will live. And of course, the real importance of the bronze serpent was to bring the person back and focus the person back, his thoughts back on God, and because ultimately the plague of the snakes was a plague of people losing their faith in God, people losing their purpose and their focus in life. A plague which plagues us today and takes the lives of many people today. Even if they stay alive, it can take their life. And that serpent, we're taught later that serpent was kept as a bit of memorabilia, so that people would remember that this miracle actually took place in the desert, and it was kept in the holy temple, and some centuries later it was actually destroyed because it had become a bit of people were looking at it and saying, "Ooh, there's powers in that. There's powers in that bronze serpent." It was becoming a bit of an idolatry. So it was actually destroyed so that the people would not continue to do that. In this week's Parsha, as I mentioned earlier, we begin to witness the wars and the battles that Israel has to fight and win in order to get where it needs to go, that being land of Israel. And we understand that these battles pick up the story of the 40 years in the desert, most likely somewhere much closer toward the end of the 40 years. And that we're moving right along, and that really we're pretty close and getting closer all the time, and geographically to the land of Israel, and also chronologically to the time when Israel will eventually enter the land. Of course, this week's Parsha ends off as Israel encamps opposite Moab, which is just east of the land of Israel, Canaan. And of course, next week begins the story of Bilam, the heathen prophet, and Israel's struggle with him and with Moab. And so clearly we see that all the troubles that befell Israel throughout the 40 years in the desert are slowly but surely coming to an end. Fact is, when we count up all the different negative incidents, even disasters that are written about here in the book of Numbers, whether it be the complaining about no meat, the complaining about the water, or the spies, or Korah, or any of the other incidents that are mentioned, if you look at it over a 40-year period, not a whole lot of negative things. They must have had a lot of very quiet, peaceful, quality time with God in those 40 years in the desert. I mean, you look at the news today, whether it's real news or whether it's fake news, whatever, every day you can get your fill of disasters, of scandals, of horrible things, whether it's the local news or whether it's the world news. You take your pick. The fact of the matter is there's a lot of bad and discouraging and negative news happening all the time. And if you were to write a book and say, this is what happened in the year 2017, and just fill it with all the bad stuff, someone 1,000 years from now reading it would say, wow, well, what horrible people they lived, what horrible things they did. But if you balance it out, if you look at your own life, and hopefully there's lots of good and lots of peaceful moments in your own life, the good and the bad, it's all there. But you try to balance it out and move on. And obviously, the children of Israel were still a part of the program, and it was still God's agenda to get them into the land. And despite all the discouraging blows that befell them, most of them self-inflicted throughout the 40 years, they did make it. And we're here today, even after another 4,000 years of ups and downs. We're here today, still in the land, and still working hard to come through and to not disappoint God and to fulfill all his dreams about who we can be and what we can accomplish here in the land of Israel. And I'd like to thank you for bearing with me. I know it's not easy. Last week and this week on Temple Talk. And you bet no one is looking more forward to the return of Rabbi Richmond than I. Next week, he'll be back. I thank you once again for listening. Temple Talk.